Hello, and welcome to the Federal News Network series, Delivering the Tech That Delivers for Government, sponsored by Future Tech Enterprise. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and my guest today is Bob Ritchie. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at SAIC. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to talk with you today about how SAIC is evolving its enterprise technology, particularly when it comes to managing hyperscale environments, taking advantage of OpEx models, and all continually innovating, because I know that's a huge piece of it for your team. So let's jump in. How does taking on federal customers' mission demands in the cloud change your organization's enterprise technology and lifecycle management strategy?
Yeah, great question. I'd say the focus on mission has had a real shift in how we take on from a strategic standpoint, how we take on the requirements and the delivery of those objectives. That it's no longer, you mentioned enterprise IT, which historically was very focused on SLAs and getting to a level of availability and resiliency. And those things are foundationally important. But in the end, you can result in what we call watermelon metrics, where everything looks green on the outside, all systems are up all the time. Especially when leveraging cloud, you can get to a high availability and a high resiliency, but the mission is not actually operating at its peak optimal. So the throughput, if it's like a back office forms processing ecosystem, or a decision advantage tool in command and control for the warfighter, that's really where we've kind of leaned into how do we tie the mission objectives and the mission outcomes in driving our technical requirements. So this does have second order effects back to the architecture that we do, whether it's cloud or edge. But it also gives us a profound lean in on focusing on building for the edge and building for that austere environment when the mission calls for it, and also building for higher classification levels. So there's the cloud, it doesn't have parity yet today across unclass and then secret and top secret. And so understanding where the mission needs to operate and the interoperability of data from high to low drives a lot of our enterprise requirements. So that's both internal to the company and how we create an ecosystem where us and our peers and startups and venture portcos can all exist at the right classification level to experiment fast and then get those experimentations operationally hardened and into the ecosystem to deliver those outcomes for the mission.
Right, that'll lead directly into my next question, because you started mentioning partners. You obviously mentioned the federal agencies that you're serving, plus all the internal teams and all the different organizations within SAIC, right? So talk about that impact on the CTO organization and supporting all those teams, because they are managing across, right, multi-cloud hybrid environments that need to meet those customer needs. But there's also that issue of what should stay on-prem, because you said not everybody's parallel, right? And
Yeah.
especially different levels of security.
Yeah. So um, there's a pragmatism to understand, like there was this, obviously the cloud first and cloud smart initiatives of the 2010s that everyone was really excited. Let's put everything in the cloud, and maybe didn't focus on just fundamental enterprise architecture, whether it's software or hardware or hybrid, that has kind of bitten a little bit, not just in the federal government space, state and local government space, but even in commercial. And you start to see, in some cases, a repatriatization where folks are thinking, well, I jumped head first into the cloud, feet first into the cloud. And now I'm having some regrets because I didn't necessarily plan out as the CapEx to OpEx flip. I didn't understand what having my utilization-based pricing and how I used to live in a data center and how that is actually a different business model more than it's a different technology architecture. So while the technology does enable you to move really quick and be nimble and adapt to your changing mission needs, it also comes with a higher level of discipline required in understanding whether that's telemetry from a cybersecurity standpoint, from an OpEx compute and store standpoint. And then you can make those pragmatic decisions about what should live on-prem. There's also the concept of, especially in the federal government, when it comes to cloud computing, the certified regions of the cloud, and I'm going to set aside Google for a second, but the certified regions of the cloud that are available for use for impacts levels 4, 5, and 6, and then up to the top secret and SCI levels, are all hosted in the continental US, right? And so you have this aspect of latency. It's just, none of us can change physics. It's one of my favorite subjects in school growing up was physics. And the speed of light is the speed of light. That's, a constant. And so the idea of needing kind of that data processing at the edge, AI inference at the edge, decision advantage at the edge, but getting to an eventual consistent global fuse picture for decision makers back, say at the Pentagon or in El Segundo, that they need that global picture, you kind of create this hybrid architecture. But then it also, to your point, it really helps drive what needs to stay on-prem, and less about what needs to stay on-prem because it only will work on-prem, and more that the mission needs it close to where the mission is being executed. The other side of that is, and this is kind of I was at Capital One for a little while and grew a much broader and deeper respect for mainframes. And what I mean by that is mainframes were a four-letter word for me growing up in terms of modernizing architecture, modernizing, and say, even internal to SAIC in the early 20s or early 2000s was a big part of what we did, was getting off our own legacy mainframes when we were doing ERP systems for DLA. And then you go to a place like Capital One and they lean into, well, we're modernizing off our mainframes, but we still see mainframes as a critical part of our ecosystem or part of our architecture, and that they process transactions more reliably and at a cheaper price point than any cloud provider can offer. That doesn't mean you should do what everyone did in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s and put all your business logic there. But you have an opportunity to balance pulling your business logic out to cloud native ecosystems and architectures, but leaving mainframe transaction processing in place in a very secure way. And you start to see these fabrics evolve. IBM actually has a really nice cohesive picture where they balance quantum computing of the future, their own AI processing unit, similar to Google's tensor processing unit, as well as their mainframe ecosystem, and how that fabric of the future will really decide workload by workload what's the optimal compute and storage and processing that job or that mission needs at any given point in time. And I mentioned I'd circle back on Google. The reason why is Google's regions are global, and so everyone else's CONUS region, and so Google also presents a really interesting kind of architectural decision point for a lot of our federal customers in terms of leveraging at impacts levels 4 and 5 this globally distributed cloud ecosystem to make different decisions about what's on edge and what's in the cloud.
And in the federal government, you've mentioned a lot of DoD examples, but also spread across the whole US, there's several agencies that have that edge need, and are trying to balance needs for high-level computing, IRS, Social Security. They have a huge, need for that massive compute power. So therefore, they are looking at that balance, right, between the mainframe and what's in the cloud.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Specifically in the federal financial space, whether it's Bureau of Fiscal Services, IRS, Social Security Administration, PBGC, any of the larger agencies that are built around high volume transaction processing actually look a lot like kind of the Fin 100 type of, or Fin 10 type of banks in terms of the way that they're evolving their architectures, and yes, have to make that trade-off of what's my cost for MIPS. If I can get my MIPS down, I'm actually at a reasonable price point. And now then you start to look at physical infrastructure. Do I need a whole data center if I've only got these few mainframes? And so there's a lot of interesting startups emerging in kind of the gray area between private cloud and public cloud, and some have bring your own metal sort of hosting options. And so those are starting to be explored as well.
It's really interesting. It's a really dynamic and changing environment, and the way people are thinking about it, and kind of, I think, in a new way, right, than they were for a long time along that cloud first, cloud strategy, cloud smart path. Let's talk a little bit though, from your perspective. What are the challenges for your organization when it comes to supporting that consumption-based OpEx model, and even extending that to that approach of like that on-prem environment? Because as you said, you're treating it in a different way. You're treating that on-prem environment and managing it in a different way, right?
Yeah. So I'd say, just from a crawl, walk, run sort of perspective, a lot of it, and this started in kind of 2015 timeframe with Kubernetes' initial launch, was how do I get to a universal platform? And you see a lot of this in the DoD with Cloud One and Platform One as a means of kind of balancing the complexity of the ecosystem by having platforms that you can rely upon. And so instead of iterating on everyone having to invent from the ground up, it's no different than the hyperscalers of saying, I'm going to give you the IaaS layer for free, or even some PaaS services, in some cases some SaaS services as well, by normalizing on secure container orchestration in Cloud Native Computing Foundation, whether that's Kubernetes, Istio from a networking layer on top, or some of the new emergent API gateways now moving into agent gateways as agentic AI starts to take hold. Really embracing kind of that ecosystem that also allows us to tap into open source in a profound way, gives us a really structured learning path internally. So I can show, a intern in college or a new hire coming out of college, here is a career arc that is not just SAIC, not just our peers in the government contracting space, but all of industry is contributing here in this open source ecosystem. And so I think that's a really powerful balance of being able to take advantage and tap into open source and university research with government demands. And that's kind of where we see mission integration really leveraging from the open source world. Yes, there are COTS solutions out there also that will be an important part of the fabric moving forward, whether that's OpenAI or Anthropic, data mesh, data architectures with companies like Palantir and AIP Foundry. Those all have a place in this ecosystem. And that's kind of where we're focusing our learning internal as a foundational level, on certainly on hyperscale cloud, to understand not just the technology side, but building fiscally responsible architectures, but then also the portability and how do you trade off that portability from edge to cloud, and then build these hybrid ecosystems where you're going to have, mainframes is a 60-year-old technology, but still is a very, the ones and zeros still process just like they did.
Exactly. Well, I think that's a great place for us to take a break. I'll be right back with Bob Ritchie. He's the CTO at SAIC, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back. I'm Vanessa Roberts, and I'm talking with SAIC's Bob Ritchie. So let's talk about emerging technologies. You were just leaning into that quite a bit, and also that innovation factor, because like you said, really early on, like learn fast, fail quick, keep applying that. How is your specific team looking to take advantage of artificial intelligence? Let's lean in there a little bit. You kind of started to talk about that in the last question.
Yeah, so I'd say about 2 or 3 years ago, when ChatGPT and GPT 3.0 really came out and the world was enamored with it, it was very refreshing, because we had kind of this skunkworks incubation within the company that had been doing vector embeddings for a long time in spaces like patent and trademark office, right? Because it's a really great opportunity if I'm looking at large volumes of Word documents on, is this novel? Is it, if I'm a patent examiner, it was a great opportunity in the 2019, 2020 timeframe where we were leaning into vector embeddings, but the large language models just hadn't gotten to that scale yet, and so it became this huge unlock for readdressing some of those customer segments and markets. Internal to the company, we also leaned in really heavily over the last 18 months into AI assisted development. So whether that was with third-party partners like Windsurf and Codium, Windsurf is the popular product and rebrand, or even internally developed capabilities leveraging Amazon Bedrock with Light LLM as a mesh in front. So you get secure access to Claude and Llama 3 and Titan and any of your other custom models that you might build. And those are where we've really leaned in the last 6 months internally to the company, because it allows us to build our own custom embeddings of our own knowledge as a company. And so as a CTO, like I have a lot of customer facing, client facing delivery, right? So I end up dealing with customer and mission challenges a lot, and that's my happy place. So thankfully the leadership here lets me stay in that happy place for most of the time. But the other part of the responsibility, as you kind of hinted on, how do we train the workforce or focus the workforce, is how do we curate our own knowledge of what makes SAIC SAIC. And so we've really leaned into leveraging whether it's kind of the RAG model in terms of internal custom RAGs, or small language models trained around specific aspects of our business, and then putting an agentic mesh on top of that so that I can give a positive employee experience where I don't necessarily need to know which agent, which model, which persona do I need to engage with, because I can just talk at a general level within the ecosystem. And so we've been leaning in really heavily there as a company the last 6 months, and had a lot of really profound progress in that space. The cool part is, I don't know if it's Conway's Law or otherwise, but we mirror a lot of our customers' challenges, right? And so we've been able to lean in with Air Force, with Treasury, with CBP. The same problems exist in terms of unlocking tribal knowledge in an organic way. And now we're being able, by having that securely delivered, you can start to tap into tactical databases and other operational data, and show how there's this future state we're moving towards, where it's almost a purely agentic, bespoke user experience, whether that's a warfighter making command and control decisions, or just everyday citizens, engaging with government services. It can now be a completely personalized experience, and we're seeing that kind of accelerate and snowball.
The agentic AI aspect is so fascinating. Also, because I think it's almost the idea we have these large language models, but then these smaller, perfected little AI applications that take advantage of all of that data um, in very unique ways and pretty quick. It looks like it's possible.
Yeah, no, and that's the speed of it has been really interesting too. Like pulling it back when you're at an unclassed level or a private enclave within a hyperscaler cloud like Amazon or Google or Microsoft, you almost don't notice the consumption model, right? Like you can
Right.
provide this employee experience or this constituent experience, or this warfighter experience, and it's very responsive, very fast, and you're not worried about the economics of how big are those data centers, how much size, weight, and power is being consumed. I said you almost don't worry about that, right? So it gets back to the original question of this capex versus opex flip, and the pragmatic reality of how much of that ecosystem is propped up on venture capital today, and the kind of inflection point in the future is there will come a time where some of those companies which are okay running at discounted rates from their GPU or having their own bespoke, that they need to get to especially as the privates become public, will need to get to a profitable standpoint, and that might change the economics of how that works. So in the meantime, that's also where we're leaning. And I said inflection is also a really great portfolio company of ours that is very focused on photonics in quantum computing, as opposed to as a means of getting to stable quantum solutions, whether that's quantum atomic clocks that they have today or quantum sensing in phased arrays. But even getting to general quantum computing as a means of changing the power dynamic of what it actually takes to maintain that kind of speed that we're all growing accustomed to in terms of the snappiness. And then putting that in a smaller form factor to have that actually get to a distributed AI, which I think quantum will play an important role over the next 5 to 10 years in getting to true distributed AI that we all experience organically in our lives.
Well, in the workspace where you're so interactive with the federal customer, right? How do you balance that moving towards that innovation that's clearly a solution, right? It's providing a solution to a challenge and a problem. How do you work toward that, work toward digital maturity, but also manage that day-to-day demand of just meeting that federal customer mission? I mean, those are missions that have to happen, right? How
Yeah.
that's a challenge, right?
Yeah, and one of the interesting unlocks there, I'd say, is embracing. It's kind of the same path we've been on as a company the last 5-6 years in terms of embracing more commercial offerings that are available today. So you look at a case management system that was bespoke and built as a government solution over 10, 15 years and costs X amount of dollars to maintain. And you could look at Appian or Pega, or even like a Salesforce or a ServiceNow that could replace that organically if you were to move to that. So it's starting to gain more momentum now to kind of embrace that you can pragmatically address the mission, take those small baby steps forward into not necessarily revolutionary IT solutions, right? Like many of these commercial solutions are not what you maybe dream about or write home about of like, I built the most innovative thing in the world. It can do if else, and go to the right answer. But it can be a huge OpEx unlock, right? If I can move towards consuming a commercial service, my price point lowers, especially if it's a secure software as a service solution. You can then free up innovation dollars to get after it. So really, that's when I talk about pragmatic enterprise architecture or software architecture, or even hybrid software hardware architectures. It's not just here's the target state and here's my current state. You show these pragmatic steps along the way. Then in some cases might feel like steps backward. I might have 9 out of 10 capabilities, but they're the 9 most used capabilities in a COTS product, but it's going to save me 90% cost that I can free up to add that 10th as a custom integration, or change the paradigm completely, right? So many of our user experiences are just digital versions of an old paper process because the paper process is the technology wasn't there to free us up to get back to what problem were we trying to solve in the beginning? What was the first principles design we set out to solve? And so we just evolved to say, oh, I have this worksheet on paper. I can make a digital form of that worksheet. And now I've advanced, I've moved forward. But that's not digital transformation. That would be more digitization of legacy process. Transformation is going to come when we lean into what the new technology can give us, and how can I rethink the problem I was trying to solve. And I think the heartburn there is it's just human nature to think in evolutionary steps as opposed to revolutionary. But this is a kind of a technology curve is moving so fast the past 3-4 years, and I think it's only going to continue to accelerate, that we're going to see customers, whether it's federal government or commercial customers or regulated industries, really lean into how do I think and solve my problem differently. And they're all going to be challenged. I'd say in the past, I made the comment before, in commercial industry, there's always competitors and there's new markets, there are new challengers coming to come and disrupt. Federal governments, it's not typically that case outside of DoD and national security, right? There's no competitor to the IRS coming to try and unseat the IRS from their business model. I think that's like a feeling is kind of changing now with this new kind of bespoke citizen experience that we have in other dimensions of our life. There's almost like an uproar of the citizens of the country to say, like, why am I not getting the same capability? No different than in the past, if a warfighter said, well, when I went through college, I was on Windows 2000, Windows XP, and now it's 2010 and I'm on Windows 95. What's the disconnect here? So it's kind of that same sense of urgency. It's not necessarily that there's another IRS that's going to emerge. It's more that the kind of new technology is becoming so approachable and so understandable that people are going to demand it in a way that's going to create that push.
Force the hand.
Exactly.
Well, talk about your own personal vision for digital maturity at SAIC. Like where do you hope that it goes, and what's your kind of ramp or runway that you see?
Yeah, so I'm going to start boring, right? My foundational side is in security, and so I'm a software developer, full stack software engineer by trade, and building secure by design and secure by default solutions is really important to me, because it's almost like the Lego blocks that we're going to compose everything else on, if it's made of brittle sticks instead of the solid rocks foundation or bricks foundation that we need. So that's one area from a digital maturity standpoint that we always engage on, both with our clients and internally, to say like, hey, you're really, really solid at these next generation technologies, but you need a foundation so you don't get like unmanaged, ungoverned hallucinations, or someone chatting with your agent and saying, what's the average salary for people in the company, like getting private information or healthcare information out. Starting from that foundation of security is really important from a digital maturity standpoint. The other is continuous delivery of value. So like a lot of times, and this isn't bespoke to the contracting world, but system integrators and IT professionals in general have an initial dopamine hit when they, something passes its unit test, the pipeline goes green. I'm like, I'm done. My user story is done. I'm excited. I can demo this user story. But until it actually gets to production and until it's actually impacting the mission, it's not actually valuable, right? You built something and you spent your time, and time is very valuable. You learned something, so nothing's ever wasted. But until you get that end user feedback, and so that's another digital maturity thing internal to the company we're really focused on, is the kind of concept of prod or it didn't happen. And prod can mean a lot of things, right? Production might be an R&D ecosystem where someone can try it out in an exercise. It doesn't have to necessarily mean it's part of a weapon system at TSSCI that's being used, but you got to get it in end users' hands to get the real feedback on it. And so that's another digital maturity thing that we're really hyper focused on.
Well, I really only have one more question before I go. I mean, this is obviously you care deeply about your work, but what really makes you passionate about what you do?
Whew, great question. So the opportunity to continually learn. So it's such a cool time to be a technologist. And I'd say my whole career, I've had the opportunity to work for really great leaders and work with really brilliant scientists and engineers across the spectrum, whether it's on the government side or internal to SAIC, or when I was at Capital One or the broader open source ecosystem. And so the cool part about it is you learn something new every day. Sometimes it's a business lesson, right? So being a technologist and then making kind of somewhat of the transition, because I'm like Peter Pan. I don't ever want to grow up into like more IT executive side, but you can learn a lot about the way business happens and the way technology decisions you need to be rooted in business outcomes as well, and mission outcomes as well. And that kind of opportunity to learn has been really exciting. And then the last 18 months with Tony, our new CEO, and Lauren, my boss, our chief innovation officer, coming 18 months ago, have doubled down on that continual learning and opened the aperture to explore autonomy. I mentioned quantum earlier, next gen energy, biotech movement. So there's the landscape of opportunity to learn is only growing, and that's what keeps me going each day.
Well, I want to thank you, Bob, so much for this great conversation today. It was really super interesting. Thank you. And I'll be really excited to see where you take SAIC next in these partnerships with the government, because obviously there's a lot still on the horizon to come. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm Vanessa Roberts, and my guest today has been Bob Ritchie, the Senior VP and Chief Technology Officer at SAIC. To learn more about enterprise infrastructure best practices, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Future Tech Enterprise. Have a great day and see you soon on Federal News Network.